Good afternoon, everyone. Just introducing myself briefly. As Sophia mentioned, I'm Richa Arora. I'm a partner with KPMG's family office, and I also lead our family dynamics and governance practice for KPMG. Just a great honor for us as KPMG to be a recurring sponsor at the Prime Quadrant Conference and supporting the great work that Prime Quadrant does and curates such a thoughtful agenda year over year. Wanted to take a moment to thank our lovely panelists, and as I mentioned, you're in for a real treat. So today we've got quite a mix of professionals here. Just by way of design, we wanted to put together sort of thoughtful questions and insights from diverse industry leaders on trends in real estate, consumer spending, geopolitical issues, to even how all of them are navigating day-to-day challenges. They'll talk a little bit about trends, their own leadership journeys. So our panelists today include Meghan Roach. She's president and CEO of Roots Canada. Karen Weaver, president of Timberlane Group, and she heads up a large single-family office. And Victoria Joly, she's a real estate broker of record and principal mortgage broker of Distinctive Advisors, and spends a lot of time on the commercial side as well as real estate on the residential real estate side. And last but not least, we've got our moderator, John Cho. He's a partner and leads our national deal advisory practice, and also is our global institutional investors group lead. So without any further delays, I'm going to pass it on to John. John, take it away.
I'm going to be very brief because you're here to hear from them and not necessarily from me. But thanks to Prime Quadrant, thank you, Risha, and thank you for being here and joining this session, because I know there's a competing session next door. I believe you picked the right one. They'll be more insightful here. And we're going to try and make this as insightful as possible, such that there's spillover in the cocktails that you continue the topics that we're going to hit on today. And so let me build on the introductions here. And it's really my privilege to be here as well with three very accomplished business leaders. I'm going to build on the introduction. So firstly, I'm going to start with Victoria Joly of Distinctive Advisors, a distinguished figure in the world of finance and real estate, celebrated for her strategic leadership and expertise across diverse sectors. Victoria started her career at IBM many years ago, maybe not so many years ago, spent a number of years in real estate, investment banking at CIBC World Markets, and also spent some time at Brookfield Financial. Along this journey, she's worked in New York, London, Hong Kong, India, Germany, and Australia. Victoria's current focus on residential real estate is an extension of her more than 3 decades of transaction experience in commercial real estate. At Distinctive Advisors, Victoria's focus remains on advising family offices and high net worth individuals, offering comprehensive guidance on all aspects of their capital structure. And on a more personal note, Victoria's upbringing is rooted in a bilingual French-Canadian Ukrainian family deeply entrenched in the garment industry. Her family were tailors and grew up immersed in the world of textiles and clothing, and to this day, she remains actively involved in designing and producing her own line of business wear. Victoria, thanks for joining us today, and look forward to the collaboration between you and Roots and Meghan later on the garment stuff. Our next panelist is Karen Weaver. Karen is the president of a newly established family enterprise, which is invested in one of Canada's largest residential and commercial real estate private enterprises. She also serves on the board of Crombie REIT since May 2020. She is the former president and CEO of MCAN Mortgage Corporation, as well as a former board director. Karen is a real estate and finance executive with a 35-year career, primarily in high-growth Canadian real estate and other publicly listed corporations as CFO, companies including DH Corporation and First Capital Realty. Karen also held positions as Senior VP and CFO of Brookfield Properties Corporation, Canadian Operations, and executive positions in a related company, Gentra. Karen started her career at KPMG in the United States and worked in the finance department at a US savings and loan focused on real estate lending. Karen is recently designated as a family advisor and a certified director by ICD, and she previously worked as a director at private company advisory board for major owner-operator of apartment portfolios in Canada and the United States, and was a trustee of the Northwest Healthcare Properties REIT board. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you.
And then finally, I am pleased to introduce our third panelist this afternoon, Meghan Roach, the president and CFO of Roots Corporation. Before becoming CEO of Roots in 2020, COVID year, it must have been fun, Meghan served as the interim CFO. She spent most of her career in private equity with roles in North America and Europe for Searchlight Capital Partners and Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. Meghan commenced her career at KPMG. In addition, Meghan has held numerous board roles with public and private companies globally. She sits on the board of directors for Roots. Meghan also acts as the vice chair for the Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital Foundation. She holds an MBA from the University of Oxford, a Bachelor of Commerce from Queen's, and an FCPA designation, which was recently awarded, which is a prestigious fellow distinction by the CPA organization. Meghan was also very recently named as one of Canada's most powerful CEOs and top 100 most powerful women in Canada by WXN for 2023. Congratulations on that, Meghan. And if you're looking for a stand-up comedian, she moonlights as a stand-up comedian as well, and holiday parties around the corner, so I'm sure Meghan, you'll be maybe open for bookings later for these parties. Yeah. Not this year, okay. All right, well, thank you again to all our panelists, and let's get into the conversation here. So there's a lot of content we can cover. I understand there's been a lot of great insights shared already today, so we're gonna do our best to make this additive as well to what's already been covered. We're gonna hit on a few topics, and there's a lot of interconnectivity between the topics. It's gonna be real estate, consumer spending and behaviors, brand management, as well as investing and what the investable landscape looks like today. And then we're going to wrap with some thoughts on leadership in this environment. So with that, let's start with real estate. And we are coming off of we're near the end of a fairly volatile 2023. And how would you characterize the year we've had in real estate, both in Canada and here in Toronto? And any key differences between residential and commercial markets that you'd like to point out? Let's start, Victoria, with you.
Well, I have to say, for those of us who've been in the business for 30 plus years, this year, 2023, has been somewhat familiar. And I know you're going to say, gosh, we're going to focus a little bit on Canada and then Canada's economic engine, which is Toronto. What's familiar about this? If you look at the last quarter in residential real estate, we've got very low sales volumes. October posted about 6,000 units. We typically sell residential units in Toronto. We typically sell about 175, 180. Let's put this into a context. There are 77,000 members of the Toronto Regional Real Estate Board, 77,000. So you look at the averages, 25% of the revenue gets generated by, or 75 by 25% of the agents. So you look at the deal volume, we're expected to do this year about 70,000 units. So that means every real estate agent in Toronto doesn't even sell one house. But this is what we experienced in certainly the early 90s when, you know, the compos of Bramalese. We've been here before. The challenge is for those tremendous contributors that have joined the industry and are likely under 40, this feels very unnerving. But we've been here before, and we're going to get through this. On the commercial side, it's a different story. We've been here before in 1997. So this quarter, 4 landmark transactions were completed. I'm going to be very brief. There was the Apotex sale-leaseback of a Vaughan industrial portfolio, $638 million, bought by W.P. Carey out of the United States. On the tails of that, for those who know the Spanish company that owns Zara, they bought for $1.2 billion the Royal Bank Plaza. They just closed on a significant FedEx distribution center. The Hazelton Hotel, all credit to some great work that Karen's done when she was at First Capital, just sold to Hennick's Group for $1.3 million a door. And then on the final piece of it, Lifetime bought 14 Roehampton, 34 units. They're applying to put up 614. What's very familiar is in times of uncertainty, opportunistic capital, a lot of private equity go in and buy the best in class because it's not going to be there when the market's hot.
That's right. I love Victoria because, oh, and by the way, I've known her for about 25 years. And she always has these fantastic stories and always sounds so engaging. So my take on where we are today is very similar, but I actually have a statement for it. It's just like, welcome back to reality, people. Okay, so I started at the savings and loan that was a failed savings and loan in the US. It happened to be owned by Royal Trust Corporation. How many people are old enough to remember Royal Trust Corporation?
Oh,
Okay,
good.
$30 billion institution, failed. I joined when it became Gentra, $4 billion of assets, $4 billion of liabilities, 13-cent share price. It used to be one of Canada's blue chip companies for 100 years. What brought it down? Real estate. What brought that down? Speculative building. And that's one thing that makes me feel a little bit better right now about where we are. But the other thing that brought down all but 2 real estate corporations in the early 1990s was debt. So if you want to have a sustainable real estate company, and if you yourself own 4 or 5 condos, because we didn't have that phenomena back then, but we sure have it today, you're a real estate company, and you cannot be laden with debt in order to get through one of these cycles. Now, if you live in your home, that's different, because the Canadian consumer has a history of protecting their homes, which is different from investing in condos. Protecting your home, you will forego consumer spending. You will forego luxuries and pleasures and more outings if you need to stay at home and pay down your mortgage. That's what you will do. Canadians love home. And of course, I'm not talking about the homes that are apparently all about money laundering in British Columbia. Hopefully we're not talking about those. But the other thing that I have to say about the whole housing situation today is that it varies by province. So what we see in Ontario is the absolute worst in the country. The worst in terms of the supply deficit and the worst in terms of the demand. Very high demand. So don't assume that you can take today's situation in Ontario and apply it across the country. It's different. BC and Alberta are much more balanced markets, and Alberta's more affordable. Quebec actually is perhaps leaning on an oversupply situation. They do not have the immigration as the rest of the country. And the East is growing. Halifax has a severe shortage of housing. Based on their immigration, very high quality of life there. And so I think that what we see in Ontario, we're gonna have so much pain in the next 3 to 5 years until we are able to rebalance.
And Karen, as we look ahead to 2024, how are you thinking about that? What inflection points are you expecting to see, if any?
I think that more reality, so we're now into the 4th quarter of 2023. We just saw the statistics that came out this week. I think that we will have more of the same. I trust that the Bank of Canada will do what they're saying, and they will continue to hold or increase interest rates until they get the inflation at the rate that they want it to be. So we can expect that. And it's a very simple rule. I learned it from one of my old bosses, Joly Siegel, a quite brilliant man. It's very simple, Karen. When rates go up, values go down. It's that simple. When rates go down, values go up. But they do change. And we had, I don't know, what was it, 20 years of low, stable rates. And so there's a very large cohort of people who have never operated in the place that we are at. I was fortunate. When I came to this country, I closed a 9.5% mortgage. Boy, was that a wake-up call.
Well, that's the thing we were commiserating. I know debt costs are going up. We understand the pain people are in. But for first-time home buyers that locked in their mortgage at 12% for 5 years, because her older sister locked in at 18% for 5 years when she thought interest rate or mortgage interest rates were going to go to 23. We're talking, decades ago. But we've been there. And I tell you, I stayed at home, I cooked at home, I cleaned. So we've all been there. The difference being, and we've got to put it in relative terms, what's the upside? At a 7% mortgage, on every payment, do you know how much principal you're contributing to? So your capital appreciation, even in a flat market or a slight softening market, is still stronger than the generation we came out of. It will be fine. We're Canada's economic engine. It's going to be a tough little time for a while.
Right. And Meghan, what about your thoughts? You've had exposure to real estate in your current life or prior lives. Anything to add here?
Yeah, so I guess I'd maybe take a step back and break it into a couple different buckets, right? So I don't think you can think about industrial real estate, commercial real estate, and residential real estate all the same.
Correct.
So when you're looking at those different pockets, I mean, industrial real estate is at very high occupancy rates right now. There's a ton of demand. If you go back 5 years, the rental rates in industrial real estate have almost tripled in a lot of cases, right? So that's a very different situation. From a residential perspective, I agree with everything that's being said here. I also think that we have to remember that in the Canadian marketplace, about 65% of people's mortgages are going to be refinanced in the next 3 years, right? Very different than the US market. The US had about 40% of people sign up to mortgages in 2020 and 2021 at very low interest rates. And obviously their term and amortization matches, right? So very, very different. And then the commercial landscape, I'm sure many of you have exposure to that. Part of the consideration there is that people are not willing to reduce their cap rates. So while there's a lot of occupancy and availability, if you're actually going out there and trying to get new office space right now, there's not a lot of deals, right? There's some deals, but not a ton. Because a lot of the owners now are the big pension plans, they're willing to take the longer term perspective in terms of saying, I'd rather leave it empty than reduce my cap rate by selling it to you or renting it to you at a lower level. So I think the landscape is just very different depending on the type of real estate that you're looking at and something you have to consider. And I think, very much so, we're obviously in a different position now. Interest rates look cheap when you're looking back at, 17, 15, all these different rates. But I think for a lot of the younger generation, baby boomers, 14% of mortgages, right? Obviously the younger generation that's renting and that's getting into mortgages now, for them, who has predominantly grown up in a very low interest rate environment, this is a very different experience for them, right? And I think the other piece to mention is that, as was alluded to by Karen Victoria, it's not really just the interest rates driving that challenge, it's the increase in immigration, right? So the high immigration rates into Canada, everything happened during the pandemic, that was already putting pressure on housing supply and already putting pressure on prices from a real estate perspective, and that's obviously contributing to the current situation we're seeing here right now.
Yeah. And it sounds like, or looks like the government at all levels are leaning into this topic around affordability and managing supply as well as demand now with some of the announcements around immigration targets. What about downtown office and perspectives around that in terms of what that looks like going forward? Obviously, a lot of companies in the downtown core, KPMG included, are still managing this remote hybrid work environment, and construction doesn't help as well in the core. But we're not alone. All across North America, many cities in the office, in the downtown core, foot traffic is down materially, and that obviously has repercussions on value in the real estate as well as surrounding businesses. But any thoughts on what that could look like going forward around office real estate?
Yeah, John, there's a lot of discussion amongst every owner-operator in terms of the remote work. And everybody, well, there was a lot of reference 2 years ago to we're getting back to a new normal. There's no new normal. This is the current economy. And a lot of companies, from an HR perspective and an occupancy perspective, is they're matching their goals and objective. What we're going to see going forward, and a lot of landlords are coming to this, is that there's a care category of employee. If you provide childcare and you provide adult care or disability care, you have a productivity benefit for not commuting and being there for the emergency situations. You don't have to take a day off work to go pick your child up from daycare. There are some productivity enhancements. What we anticipate going forward is companies are going to work with the employees. Employment numbers are very high. And as we move forward, we're going to get better at offering employees categories of employment. And I think they're doing as much as they can to further address and listen to their workforce, because the cost of attrition is just so punitive on companies. So they're listening, they're trying, they're coming up with solutions. There's a lot of discussion, thought leadership. working sessions, and I think that will continue to the betterment, I think, of the landlord and the employee.
Right. Karen, anything to
In
add?
2015, I worked for a global company, and I had 7 finance teams on 5 continents. Now, how do you think I managed? Right? I had technology. I had Teams, although it probably was called Skype or something like back then. We had meetings at 7, well, my time 7 a.m., but we figured out how to manage. Did we have the luxury of getting together and having, lunch or dinner like I would with my management team here, over the last several years? No. But did we get our work done and did we communicate? Absolutely. So when I look at what happened in COVID and how we had to all of a sudden learn, and we were in the mortgage business, I was at MCAN at the time, we suddenly had to figure out how to operate from home. Thankfully, we were already on the technology direction, but then all of a sudden, what happened to the mortgage market? Well, it just went like this. So our volumes and our, the demand side of our time went through the roof. So we had to figure out, we simply did not have a choice during lockdown of how does one operate the business. So today, I'm still a remote work. I want to come downtown, I want to do this. I want to go to dinner tonight with my friends, I want to have a coffee with Victoria, I want to have a breakfast tomorrow morning. That's what I want to do when I come downtown. It would be great to have meetings with my executive team when I'm working on something, but I don't need to come to the office every day to be productive and get things done. So I'm with Victoria. That this is a new normal, or sorry to use that term, you disagree, this is it, and we will continue to figure it out. And I think it's really important to understand that the impact of technology on this change.
Indeed. So many layers to this conversation, and by the way, we're going to leave some time at the end for questions as well. Let's shift gears. Let's shift over to consumer spending, and there's a lot of interconnectivity, obviously, between real estate, in particular residential real estate, and consumer confidence, consumer spending. So Meghan, as someone that leads consumer-facing business, and also someone that's invested as a private equity investor in the consumer sector, what are your thoughts on the current environment and the impact of consumer behavior and spending today?
Well, I think, again, you have to look at the consumer across different markets, right? I think the Canadian consumer is in a much different spot than the US consumer. And I think you're seeing that through the rates, right? So if you look at the GDP in Canada, the last one we had, it's declining, right? We're seeing a negative GDP. The US GDP was, I think, 4.6, 4.9 last quarter. Very, very different. I think part of that stems from what we were talking about before, which is that, the US consumer is in a different spot from a mortgage perspective. Obviously, they're also just coming off the back of some pretty hefty stimulus. And so, I think both economies are in for a rough 6 months, 6 to 12 months from my perspective, from a consumer perspective. And you see that in the consumer sentiment. Consumer sentiment in both the US and Canada is declining. In the US, the consumer sentiment is at a rate that indicates that people believe a recession is coming, which is different from a consumer perspective than what, when you talk to CEOs or economists, they think very differently. And then in the Canadian economy, we're at all-time lows in terms of consumer sentiment over the last 10 years. So taking out the pandemic, this is the lowest we've been in terms of consumer sentiment, right? And so I think the consumer is in a difficult position. I think when you speak to the Bank of Canada, you sit down with the governor, he is very focused on bringing interest rates down. Now, the only tool he has, inflation, the only tool he has is interest rates. And he's looking for indicators. He's looking to see that the demand is slowing. He's looking to drive consumers to stop spending. I mean, that's his job, right? And so the reality is, I think that we're going to continue to see consumers be squeezed. Canadians tend to pay their mortgages. They tend to have very low delinquency rates. And so as a result of that, they're taking that money away from consumer discretionary spending and putting it in something else. And I think the final thing, which is interesting, is that one of the things that, if you go back to 2008, which was different, is that it sounds silly, but social media is much more prevalent now. Things like Instagram, TikTok, which many of you may not be on, almost 50% plus people are now getting their news from those types of sources. So 20% of the people under the age of 35 use TikTok as their main source of news, right? So when you talk and you look at some of the Bank of Canada surveys around perceptions of inflation, the inflation perceptions compared to the actual inflation are quite different, right? And part of that's because of the news cycles. And so I think we also have to take into consideration that from a consumer perspective, even though we know it's likely the Bank of Canada will maybe hold rates for a little bit given the GDP declines, The consumer is worried. They're worried about interest rate increases, and it's causing them to change their spending. And I think the final piece is that consumers are smart, right? They hear the rhetoric about the fact that the economy is not great, and so they think about how to put their spend in different places. So you're looking to see a lot of consumers looking for value now, and that's causing trading down effects in a lot of businesses also.
That's great. Someone may have already posted an Instagram story on this.
I'm sure. I'm sure. Hopefully not TikTok, but we'll see.
And so, what about you mentioned 2008 and what was different or similar. What about the prevalence of e-commerce? How would you comments and thoughts on that, especially through COVID and the acceleration of adoption? Thoughts on that in terms of impact on consumer spending today?
It really hasn't impacted consumer spending as much as just changed the pie, right? So pre-COVID, what you saw was, people were spending obviously in e-commerce, and there was a preference, right? You saw some people really wanted to go to stores, some people really wanted e-commerce, and it was a small percentage that just wanted e-commerce, right? Maybe 20%. And now what you're seeing is it's a higher percentage that wants both. So this omni-channel concept has really risen. And what's happening is it's just moving the pie around. And so what the pandemic did is it really catapulted that investment in omni-channel. So you saw a lot of businesses focusing on curbside, buy online, pick up in store. I mean, ourselves, we actually made it so that all of our stores can fulfill e-commerce. So if you buy something online today, it might come from our distribution center or it might come from the store in Vancouver. It really depends on where the good is, right? So I think it really advanced that. But the reality is consumers are now just going back to whichever channel they prefer. And broadly, you're seeing a big chunk of people are now sitting in the omni-channel space and it's driven by convenience. So it hasn't increased the overall pie from a consumer discretionary spending perspective. It's really just more moved the figures around.
Okay, great. Karen, Victoria, anything to add on
well,
this
I
topic?
just want to say that as a former retail landlord at First Capital, we very much focused on urban shopping for everyday life was how we coined it. And I would say that today that is still incredibly resilient in urban and non-urban markets in terms of investing and in retail success. So I'm sure that some of the malls are, particularly some of the US malls, are not doing very well. Some of our malls in the GTA, as you know, are doing extremely well. But the retail consumer non-discretionary goods and services has shown to be reliable through multiple economic cycles.
I couldn't agree with that more. You do see differences. So to Meghan's point, I couldn't agree more with her. Consumers want both, the e-commerce and brick and mortar. Some of the segments of consumer spending, though, in the suburban context, restaurants, I think they'll feel for certain people are going to give up eating out. And so you're going to see segments of consumer spending, and by an extension, the asset classes directly affected by that, impacted probably more than anything else. The only thing is, if you look at residential housing, you don't have dining rooms, formal dining rooms anymore. Everybody wants main floor office, and 2 of them would be better. Formal living rooms are being turned into other working space. They want great rooms, functional kitchens, and they want to order in. So that's a generalization, and please, not any fabulous chefs here, cooks, I'm not meaning to offend. But you're looking at really changes in lifestyle, because the velocity at which 90% of us run today is at a pretty hysterical level. So a lot of convenience, a lot of comfort, a lot of luxury, but it's just going to be curbed by affordability and some of the realities of what we've mentioned here today. And back, actually, Meghan, to your concentration, 65% of the mortgages that we'll be renewing, what does that sound like? That's $900 billion worth of mortgage money. And guess what? That's for the top 5 banks in Canada. So there's a lot of things happening where I think there's going to be Bank of Canada involved, the banking system involved, mortgage agents involved, realtors involved, the consumers. I think we're all coming to a mutual pain point, and we've all got to work together a little bit.
And maybe I just add something on as it relates to the malls too. So we talk about e-commerce. What's interesting about that is that when you saw the pandemic happen, you saw a lot of new people build e-commerce businesses, and there's a lot of startups that focus on e-commerce first. What they're finding now is they need to have physical retail. So what's also buoying the malls is the fact that kind of post-pandemic, traffic is predominantly going back to the physical landscape. And so there's omni-channel, but it's also driving back to physical. And so a lot of those players are trying to open stores. And so that's also like when you think about the differences between the different real estate landscapes, that's one of the reasons malls are actually maintaining more stability. And in Canada, because of the network of retail across the country is very different than the US, you've got a lot of A and B malls. You don't have as much kind of D and C malls as you do. And so as a result of that, they're definitely maintaining a lot more stability than you're seeing in other countries.
And Megan, what's driving that in terms of e-commerce only businesses now creating a physical space? Just customers are expecting that to look, to feel, and see it?
Yeah, I think that the reality is that it's very difficult to build a brand and drive brand engagement when you're only online. People want to touch and feel the products, right? And so it really depends. And so I think that we saw a lot of people use e-commerce out of convenience. People do like to still use it for convenience purposes, but people like to touch and feel products. And so there's these brands that are now trying to say, well, how can I, first of all, like how can I continue to expand? E-commerce generally is declining for most businesses. And so as a result of that, they're saying, well, how can I keep up that growth I saw during the pandemic? And to do that, they have to open physical retail stores. And then the other reason is just to actually give their consumers an ability to engage with the brand on a grassroots level.
Great. Let's bring the topics we've discussed into the investing world and many investors in this room. And as we all know, capital doesn't stay still. It may slow in movement, but it will always move at some point and velocity will pick up. And obviously we're in an environment where it is slowed. How are you thinking about the investable landscape going forward? Take this wherever you will, real estate or otherwise. And with the backdrop of a more difficult macroeconomic environment, the geopolitical environment, which maybe how are you thinking about, what are you seeing in terms of investment flows today? And maybe let's start, Victoria.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, and the people in this room can probably identify as you work with your strategic advisors on the path forward, a much heavier weighting on the risk analysis fundamentals of your investment portfolio. And we're finding a real focus on let's consider all the way to the highest risk returns of return of capital versus the return on capital. It used to be, let's risk adjust our returns on capital. Now they're saying, okay, preservation of the base, how are we doing? They get right into the operation, the demography that supports whatever the investment. So that's what I see more of, is people are facing the headwinds or the risks available, or ahead, excuse me, and they really want to talk about it. And so that's probably the biggest difference. People are coming in early saying, okay, I'm not sure, let's survive till 2025. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. And I think that early dialogue is just transparent and helpful. And I think it might save the day.
That's great. Karen, your thoughts?
Yeah, for, I'll have to say decades now, every morning I walk in to wherever my office is, and I think about risk. All right, everything I do all starts from the perspective of what risks do I have in my landscape and in what time frame? Often I'm thinking out 5 and 10 years. So when I look at an investment platform, and because of my background and my training, I'm very conservative. So I like land, I like assets I can kick, and I like land with income and infrastructure. We heard that today, so this should be no surprise. But you asked, so in a way, nothing's different. My principles of how I address the risk in the landscape is only enforced more.
And certainly I see that with my clients. It's obviously a more defensive mindset of what are the risks and am I being fairly compensated for the risks seems to be the initial starting point versus what is the opportunity and what is the upside, which is what it has been for many years. With risk obviously part of the equation, but just a different mindset. And Megan, obviously, you were an investor before in private equity. What thoughts on this topic?
I think the landscape's changing, and I think that what's also changed is the fact that the geopolitical impacts are making it such that you have to really look at market by market, right? So, I mean, as I alluded to before, the Canadian consumer is in a very different spot than the US consumer. If you're looking, internationally, I mean, a lot of people are talking about Japan. There's a lot of different markets now in terms of how they're playing out, right? So when we look at our business, when we think generally, I mean, I'm more thinking about, okay, can I grow in China and pull back in Canada and think about how I invest in the US? So looking at the different markets, I think is really important, and spending the time understanding the nuances between them is quite key. I would say you're definitely going to see private equity pulling back for the next couple of years until the interest rates come down. I mean, it's just not as attractive. But similarly, I mean, this is a great time to buy assets because the deals are there, right? The value is there. And so, I had my first stock when I was 12, and I'm going to tell you that being both a public and private market investor, I mean, I'm out there scouring the market to see where I can see things that have been overpegged in terms of just, oversold. And so there's a lot of opportunities from that perspective. And then I think the other thing to consider is as you're looking at your own portfolios, being an individual who's part of a Canadian company now, the reality is you might see us as a Canadian company, but we're not, right? Because we have our second largest market in Taiwan, we manufacture in Ukraine, we have a big operation in China from a manufacturing perspective. So I would just encourage people to kind of look through maybe what the initial perspective seems to be, because a lot of Canadian companies now are really actually massively exposed to geopolitical and other risks. And so thinking through that when you're thinking about your investing portfolio is something that's really top of mind for me.
And just on that topic of geopolitical risks, and obviously a lot of unfortunate events happening in today's world, how do you think about that in terms of impact and spillover effect on operating models, supply chain disruption, production delays or issues, impact obviously on inflation thereafter, but how do you think about that?
Well, I think that one of the big reasons we saw the increase in inflation was obviously the war in Ukraine, right? And also the fact that China was shut down for a couple of months, and as a result of that, nobody could get goods out. And pre-pandemic, over 60% of apparel was made in China or impacted somehow by China because so much of cotton comes from China, which a lot of people don't realize, right? So even if you were making it in another country, oftentimes you were getting cotton from China. And so I think as you go forward, I mean, there's a lot of diversification that's happening. A lot of people are thinking more broadly about those types of things. And I think from a geopolitical perspective, just broadly, you just have to take into consideration that we went through a phase of massive globalization. So again, a lot of companies from a Canadian perspective are really much more global in terms of impacts than you'd think. And now we're seeing the opposite effect. A lot of people are trying to bring back things domestically. They're looking at more nearshoring. People are thinking about diversification of that portfolio much more, but it takes time, right? I think, using us as an example, we've moved significant amounts of our portfolio of our apparel to sustainable materials, right? 85% plus of our clothing is now organic cotton or some kind of recycled material. We did that over the last 3 years. But the supply chains are not robust enough yet to enable us to do that across multiple different countries. So predominantly we're still in China, right? We're trying to move more out of that, but you have to just consider some of the things that are, the infrastructure is not quite there yet to enable as much diversification as you'd want. And so I think you're going to continue to see a lot of businesses through all different sectors impacted by geopolitical risk due to the historical globalization push.
Great, thank you. I think we're
out of time.
I'm getting the wrap it up sign, but maybe I'll just borrow 5 minutes from Q&A because we're at 4:45, and just 5 minutes just to touch on leadership, and let's wrap on leadership. And so I'm going to ask each of you to comment on how you as business leaders, how you as those that lead others are managing through this current environment. And also, it's obviously we have 3 women leaders here as well. So layer onto that where you see fit in terms of how, with your background as women leaders, how is that also shaping how you're currently leading through this environment? And so maybe Meghan, let's start here.
Sure. It's quite interesting because I started my career, at a different time when we were going through the tech bust, and then also through the Great Recession. I started my job at Teachers the week that Lehman crashed, which was a great time to join private equity, especially when you're focusing on assets that have a massive advertising exposure. And I would say that in the current environment, from a leadership perspective, there's some similarities with some of those historical volatilities in that it's about being adaptable. It's about being, people overuse the word pivot, but you really have to think more about the fact that there's not going to be a consistency. And so from a leadership perspective, you're obviously trying to focus on being calm and being, I think, a good leader in terms of, allowing your team to have the freakouts. So while you obviously sit up there and suggest that you're going to be fine, but you also have to be really open and very adaptable now. And I think over the last 3 to 4 years, I started as a CEO in January 2020. And the first thing I found out in February 2020 was that we had a major distribution center in Wuhan. And so it kind of went from there. And so I think the reality is that you really have to just be flexible and adaptable now. And the world is just changing rapidly. And you have to be willing to understand that you're not necessarily going to know what's going to happen next.
Yeah, that's great. Victoria?
I think the two pieces of information I'd like to impart is I just like leadership where best idea wins. And it doesn't matter who has the best idea. But if you're asking your team to be front and center in providing services to clients, strategic advice, whether it's residential, mortgage, brokerage, or commercial, you've got to empower them to be able to carry a conversation, carry a room. To Karen's point, what I think is the real failure in this remote work is you got to come into a room and say, hi, I've never met you before. My name's Victoria. I'd like to introduce myself. And then they say, and what do you do? And you do your elevator statement, and you do that. I don't know how the young entrepreneur gets that muscle memory to do that. And if you think it's easy, it's a skill. People that can carry a podium or work a room, and it's a skill. You're going through listening. And so taking your team and saying, best idea wins, and bring that conversation somewhere. Call a client and say, I was thinking about you the other day, and it could be at all the levels, touch points, and just share a story. So the most important thing I try to do, my style is a style. My ethics, my integrity are non-negotiable. And so the company will hold the ethics and character I hope to uphold and make people proud to work for Distinctive Advisors. But the most important thing as leaders is to say, when they go, Victoria, I got a great idea. Great, who can you tell? No, I got to tell you. I believe you. It's the greatest idea. Who can we try this out on? And that's where you get leaders. I find the people that I hire, I don't recognize them in a year. They're fabulous. And so those are the two things I try.
Thanks, Vic.
I'll just
Karen,
echo
yes.
the theme that Victoria ended on, is that I have always believed in developing the people. The people are actually the biggest asset of your entire firm. I don't care what kind of an asset you have. If you develop your people and you take care of them, they will take care of you. And I've always believed that if you actually help make people healthier and wiser and more educated, that they will take that to their families, and then those families will take that to their communities, and we will end up with a better and stronger society. And that is what I believe.
That's great. Thank you. So that was fantastic and very insightful. So thank you to all of you. We're going to open it up here for questions. But first of all, a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
I have a question back there.
Do you know what percentage of homes are going to be rolling over a mortgage in the next few years? Like, because obviously there's a lot of homes that don't have mortgages.
They say about 60%
60%.
of people's mortgages will roll in the next 3 years. Now, there's a lot of discussions happening on blend and extend and so on, but Meghan, what's your views on?
Yeah, I mean, that's the same. Those are the same stats that I'm hearing. I mean, I think your question is what percentage of those homes have mortgages. That answer I don't have for you. Obviously, it changes depending on the age demographic, right? So the stats that I do know is about 14% of boomers have mortgages, and then obviously it kind of varies depending where you're getting. I think the other stat to focus on is also just like debt to household income, and that's at all-time highs, right? So it's much higher than it was back in 2008. Which is obviously concerning. And so I look at both the amount renewing, but also the debt to the income ratios too.
Can I give a bit of a positive note on housing? I know affordability is a big issue, but if you have a house in Mississauga that's got a walkout basement and you're willing to sell it for $1.2 million, which there's lots of people, you will get 16 offers, a firm deal, and they will come in firm and close that in 60 to 90 days. It all depends on when you can get a bank to fund. So I know we all look at this isn't working, but there is a lot of the housing market that will sustain and get us through. It's going to be a big transition for a lot of people that use their homes as ATMs, took out HELOCs and bought a bunch of condos that are all coming in to firm occupancy and are closing, so you got to start funding them. They may have a negative carry of $1,100 a month. How much of that will be affordable? We don't know. But as Karen said earlier, if you're buying a detached home to live in, you're not moving, you're going to ride the market out. Hopefully that's encouraging.
Other questions?
Hi. Before I begin, I just wanted to thank all of you guys for coming out here. I'm actually a student at the Ivy Business School right now, and it's always really nice to hear from fierce women like yourself, so deep into your career and really diversified career. I loved hearing about what you had to say, Victoria, about integrity and what you had to say about people. I think that's a very underrated aspect of business that is very refreshing to hear. My question is specifically for Meghan. You mentioned that you were appointed CEO in January 2020. In February, you found out about the factory in Wuhan. And I was just wondering, what specific part of your experience at Teachers and private investing may have helped you during that turbulent time?
Great question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. It was a pretty rough time for a lot of people. So I think what helped me from a private equity perspective was that private equity is incredibly diverse. So, and you have a lot of disappointments. So you work a lot on deals very late. You work extremely hard. I mean, when I was in private equity, my normal hours were 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. when I wasn't doing a deal. And then it was probably 2 to 3 a.m. when I was doing a deal, and every weekend, right? I remember one time I got on a plane from Toronto to London, because I was based in London. And I landed in London, and they told me I need to get back on the plane and go back to New York. I was in the airport for about 6 hours. So I think that kind of the volatility, and you know, John knows this from his experience. I mean, when we're trying to do a deal, oftentimes the deal doesn't get done, and sometimes you're trying to sell a company and the deal doesn't get done. So you're used to the disappointment. So I think just having worked so extremely hard and had such volatility that when it came to being in that environment where I didn't really know all the answers, I was used to being in environments where I didn't know all the answers. But I think fundamentally, I mean, Karen said this, or sorry, Victoria said this, part of it also just came back to knowing your values. So one of the things that the pandemic brought onto us was that there was no good decisions. The situation was, how do I make the least worst decision? That's what it was. And so you sat there and you said, well, what are my values? What do I need to do to make sure the business is here in 6 months? And you made those decisions. But I'm sure a lot of us look back and say, in hindsight, maybe I would have made a different decision. But really, there was no experience that could have led you to be able to lead during that time. You kind of just had to figure it out as you went. And I think all of us have probably had now 20, 15 years of experience just from those kind of like 1 to 2 year period from the pandemic.
And I'm just curious, I'll definitely research this afterwards, but what ended up happening with that factory in Wuhan?
Well, I took back the China market, and now I've relaunched it myself. So,
congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. We were shut down for a long time, unfortunately.
Thanks. So thanks for the panel, very good. The speakers today were excellent. I'm thinking specifically of Mark. Victoria, you and I were having a chat. So very bright guy, very successful guy, very colorful guy. He's very bearish on the Canadian real estate market. We heard that. Can I get your thoughts on do you agree, do you disagree, and why?
I actually don't take issue with his difference of opinion. I don't at all. And I think that's also a byproduct of the leadership we've been exposed to. I like the fact that when I say to a client or anybody else, respectfully, I may stand to disagree, but I hear your opinion and we can keep talking. Would I agree with him? The mortgage fraud issue, specific to more of the West Coast, is a real issue and it's a big concern. Fraud is fraud. Cheating is cheating. Fibbing is still lying. Those core issues, and he was quite colorful. I found it quite candid and refreshing. In a lot of audiences, I don't have the courage to rip the Band-Aid off like that. I appreciated his viewpoints. I just don't think, operating in the Canadian market and having worked in many markets around the world, I just have higher hopes for Canada. And maybe it's because I'm Canadian born, I don't know. But you can like rip the Band-Aid off and keep criticizing us, but go to every country, bad people do bad things. Good leadership is just good leadership, and we have lots of it. All evidence to the 3 people to my right.
Let me ask you a question. How many of you, do 40% of you have your mortgages rolling in the next 3 years? Is anybody willing to raise their hand?
Just a show of hands, how many?
Just a show of hands, okay? Are you going to let your houses go? Right. So why are the banks in trouble? Tell me why. They're about to make more money than they've made in the last 5 years. Anyway, as long as there's demand.
Yeah, that's good.
I don't know, listen, like he really made me think, and I'm sitting here, I keep thinking about even the article in the Globe and Mail about the banks, and I'm just like, okay, well, I used to run a small bank, and I'm still trying to understand this.
That is the one thing that is different about what we're coming into. The lessons learned by Canadian chartered banks and lenders is in the early 90s, They threw back the keys, and all of a sudden the banks go, we're not in the real estate property management. So they would rather work with a borrower, keep you in the home, maintaining it, servicing the realty taxes, throwing back the keys. But, I mean, and to Karen's point is, who's the big benefactor if somebody's servicing a higher interest rate?
Yeah, the mortgage holder.
We got the,
anyway, I'm just
the
trying to
signal,
understand
the silent gong went off over there, so we're gonna have to
Okay.
wrap. We're gonna have to wrap here. But another round of applause for our panelists. That was great. Thank you so much.